Today we're going to explore the moment Diep collapses at the shack door, still apologizing through a burning fever, until James walks in, realizes he could lose her, and throws away everything, even a $1 trillion deal, just to keep her alive and finally make her feel she belongs. Up in the highlands, the rain didn't really fall. It hovered, cold drizzle that soaked you without making a sound. It clung to Diep's hair and turned the dirt path into slick mud. She leaned forward under the sack on her shoulder, forest bamboo shoots fresh and heavy, still smelling like wet earth, the strap bitten to her collarbone. Her face was pale, her lips purple from the cold, but she kept walking, because every step had a purpose. New school supplies for little Nye, clean notebooks, new pencils, maybe a small backpack that didn't rip, and work clothes for James, thicker gloves, warmer layers, something that could handle sawdust and wind. The sawmill had been having a rough stretch. Diep could feel it in the way James came home tired in a deeper way, the way he sat too long by the stove fire without speaking. Tomorrow morning he was supposed to sign a $1 trillion wood export contract, something everyone said could steady the whole operation. So Diep tried to help in the only way she knew. Work more, carry more, endure more. Ever since James had pulled her out of a life that felt like a locked room, she lived with a fear she couldn't explain without sounding small. The fear of being a burden. Like she was a debtor he rescued. Like she had to pay him back with effort, with silence, with never needing anything. Through the mist, the shack finally appeared. Low, patched, smoke threading from the stovepipe. Hockey lifted his head and trotted toward her, tail thumping once, then stopping. His ears pricked, uneasy. Diep reached for the door. Her knees buckled. At first she told herself it was the cold, the wait, a long morning. But her vision narrowed, the edges going dark. She tried to brace on the doorframe, and her legs gave out completely. She fell onto the pile of bamboo shoots, the sack splitting at the seam. Pale shoots spilled across the ground. Her breath came thin and weak, like her body had finally stopped pretending. Hockey burst into barking, sharp, urgent. He rushed to her, whining, nudging her cheek, then darting to the doorway and back, as if he could drag help with his teeth. Heat rolled through Diep in waves that didn't match the weather. Fever. Real fever. Her hands trembled as she tried to push herself up, but her arms felt heavy, useless. And the fear that hit her wasn't only about being sick. It was about being seen sick. "I'm sorry," she murmured, the words automatic. "I'm sorry, I can't cook dinner." Tears slipped down her cheeks and vanished into the drizzle. She turned her face away, ashamed of the shaking, ashamed of needing care. James didn't need this right now. Not when the sawmill was struggling. Not when tomorrow's signing mattered. She caught a glimpse of her hands, calloused, cracked, scraped from digging shoots out of cold ground. Small cuts lined her fingers. Dried blood sat under her nails. She'd ignored it all week, telling herself pain was just proof she belonged here. She tried to crawl inside just a little, to collapse where no one would see. Then she heard footsteps, fast, heavy, cutting through the rain. The door swung open. "Diep!" James's voice didn't sound like a CEO. It sounded like a man who'd been hit with sudden terror. His leather briefcase thudded to the floor as he threw it aside. He dropped to his knees in the spilled shoots and slid his hands under her shoulders. When he touched her skin, he froze. Too hot. His face tightened, eyes wide, and for a second he looked helpless, like all his confidence belonged to another life. Then he lifted her, urgent but careful, like she might break. Diep's head fell against his shoulder. "I'm sorry." "Stop," James said, voice rough. "Don't apologize. Please." He carried her inside and laid her on the bamboo bed. The thin mattress creaked. He pulled a blanket over her, then hovered, unsure what to do first. He pressed his palm to her forehead, then her cheek, trying to measure the danger with touch. Then he saw her hands, cuts, swelling, raw skin, fingers curled inward even now, like she was still holding on to work. A sob escaped him before he could swallow it back. Tears slid down his face. James, the man who could sign deals worth a fortune without blinking, sat on the edge of a bamboo bed and cried over the cost of her silence. "I should have stopped you," he whispered. "I should have seen it." He wiped his face and forced himself to move. He built the fire hotter, boiled water, poured it into a basin, and soaked a towel. He wiped her forehead slowly, gently, then he cleaned her hands, one finger at a time, careful around the cuts, whispering small, steady words. "I'm here. I've got you." Night settled in. The drizzle became a steady hiss on the roof. Hockey curled up near the bed, watching Diep's chest rise and fall, like it was his job to keep her breathing. James didn't lie down. He sat there through the dark hours, holding her hand. Each time her breathing went too shallow, his heart jumped. Each time she stirred, he leaned closer, listening. Once he heard knee turn in her sleep in the corner, a small, restless sound, and it hit him like a warning. If Diep didn't get better, what would that child wake up to? He swallowed hard, warmed the towel again, and kept wiping, steady, careful, refusing to stop. Tomorrow's schedule meant nothing now. The contract, the meetings, the $1 trillion signing, none of it mattered if Diep didn't wake up. In the dim light of the fire, James made a promise so fierce it scared him. From now on, he would not let her touch any heavy work again. Not because she wasn't capable, but because she'd been strong enough to hurt herself trying to prove she deserved love. Near dawn, the fire faded low. James fed it more wood with one hand, never letting go of Diep with the other. Then softly the door creaked. James's head snapped up. A figure stepped into the weak morning light, carrying a small pot and a bundle of herbs. "Mom," he whispered. The door opened slowly, careful, like whoever stepped in already knew the room was fragile. James lifted his head so fast his neck tensed. Then he saw his mother. Mrs. Huyen stood in the doorway with a small pot and a cloth bundle of herbs. Her coat was damp, her shoes muddy, but her eyes were sharp and focused. She looked straight at Diep on the bamboo bed, flushed cheeks, dry lips, breathing too light. "How long?" Mrs. Huyen asked. "All night," James answered, voice raw. "She collapsed outside. I didn't know she was pushing herself that hard." Mrs. Huyen's gaze dropped to Diep's hands. Cracked skin, small cuts, dried blood at the fingertips. A brief tightness crossed her face. "Raise the fire," she said. "We'll make medicine." James moved instantly. He fed wood into the stove, blew until the flame caught, and set the pot over the heat the way his mother directed. The shack filled with the bitter, earthy smell of simmering herbs. Hockey lifted his head, whined once, then settled near the bed again. James sat beside Diep, fingers wrapped around her hand. He didn't let go. As the sky outside lightened, Diep stirred. Her lashes fluttered. She tried to move and looked exhausted by the effort. When her eyes opened, they were unfocused for a second. James leaned in. "Hey, you're okay. I'm right here." Diep's throat worked. The first thing that came out wasn't a question. It was an apology. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Dinner, I couldn't." "Stop," James said, voice tight. "Please, don't apologize." Diep's gaze drifted past him, and her whole body tensed. She noticed Mrs. Huyen by the fire, sleeves rolled, tending the pot. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Diep tried, pushing herself up a little. "James has pressure. The sawmill. Tomorrow?" Mrs. Huyen crossed the room and sat beside her. Before Diep could shrink away, Mrs. Huyen pulled her into a firm embrace. Warm, steady, final. "My daughter-in-law has worked so hard," Mrs. Huyen said softly. "From now on, let James handle the heavy work. You focus on your health and little Nye." Diep blinked fast. Tears spilled down her cheeks, not because she was in pain, but because she wasn't being judged. All that insecurity, being a burden, being a debtor, having to prove her worth, suddenly had nowhere to stand. James turned away for a second, wiping his eyes with his wrist. Then he came back with a bowl of porridge, steam rising into his messy hair. No suit, no CEO posture, just a t-shirt, rolled sleeves, soot on his fingers. He blew on the spoon. "It's hot," he murmured and held it to Diep's lips. Diep hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Huyen. Mrs. Huyen nodded once. "Eat, let him." Diep took a small mouthful, then another. James fed her slowly, patiently, like this was the only thing that mattered. A soft shuffle came from the corner. "Mom!" Little Nie stepped into the light, hair sticking up, eyes heavy with sleep. She froze when she saw Diep sitting up, then ran forward and hugged her tight around the waist. Diep wrapped her arms around Nie and closed her eyes. Her body shook once, and she held on harder, terrified of how close they'd come to losing something she couldn't replace. Nie turned and grabbed James's sleeve. "You too," she said, tugging him closer. James let out a breath that sounded like a laugh trapped inside a sob. He leaned in, and the three of them pressed together on the bamboo bed, while Mrs. Huyen watched, quiet, gentle, relieved. The shack was still poor, the roof still creaked, but in that moment it felt untouchable, like Mr. Hohn's money or John's schemes could never reach what was happening in here. By late morning, Diep's fever eased. Her cheeks were less red, her eyes clearer. Mrs. Huyen kept the medicine coming in small doses, and James stayed close, rewarming towels, washing Diep's hands carefully around every cut. When the afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds, it did it suddenly, bright light spilling into the shack. James stepped outside, looked up at the clear sky, and decided on the spot. "We're eating properly today," he said, coming back in. Diep frowned. "James, you don't have to." "I do," he said, already rolling his sleeves higher. "You rest. I cook." Mrs. Huyen lifted an eyebrow. "You can cook?" James gave a quick grin. "Watch me." He started the stove himself, roasted chicken, warmed, smoked meat, and filled the room with a smell that made Diep's eyes soften. He kept glancing over, and each time he saw more color in her face, his shoulders loosened. They ate together. Nie laughed, chattering between bites. Mrs. Huyen ate quietly, watching them like she was storing the scene away. Hockey lay at their feet, calm. After the meal, when the light softened and the valley outside turned lush and green, James pulled a small notebook from his bag and sat beside Diep. Diep stared at it. "What's that?" "Our plan," James said, flipping it open to a clean page. "Income and expenses. The clean agricultural store." Diep swallowed. "But that's your plan." James shook his head. "It's yours." He placed a pen in her hand and gently curled her fingers around it. "I'm going to teach you how to record everything," he said, "because you deserve to know what you own, what you earn, what you're building." Diep looked at the blank page like it was a door she'd never been allowed to open. Her heart beat fast. James leaned close, voice low but steady. "You are no one's slave," he said. "You are the boss of your own life. And my lady." Diep's lips trembled into a bright, surprised smile. "Okay," she whispered, "teach me." James guided her hand as she wrote the first lines, careful at first, then steadier. Nie leaned over, watching with serious interest. Outside, the valley stretched wide under the sun after rain, and for the first time, the future didn't feel like something Diep had to earn with pain. It felt like something waiting for them, real, bright, and finally within reach.
Diep gục ngã trước cửa nhà giữa cơn sốt cao nhưng vẫn thì thầm xin lỗi vì không nấu được bữa tối. James trở về hoảng hốt khi chạm vào làn da nóng rực và thấy đôi tay cô đầy vết thương. Anh bỏ mặc mọi lịch trình, kể cả hợp đồng nghìn tỷ sắp ký, chỉ để ở bên chăm sóc cô suốt đêm. Bà Huyền mang thuốc thảo dược đến, dịu dàng ôm Diệp và khẳng định cô không cần chứng minh giá trị bằng đau đớn. Khi tỉnh lại, Diệp vẫn ám ảnh vì sợ trở thành gánh nặng, nhưng James kiên quyết dập tắt suy nghĩ ấy. Anh nấu ăn, tự tay đút từng thìa cháo, hứa từ nay sẽ bảo vệ cô khỏi mọi tổn thương. Buổi chiều, anh trao cho cô cuốn sổ kế hoạch kinh doanh, dạy cô ghi chép, khẳng định cô là chủ cuộc đời mình và xứng đáng được yêu thương trọn vẹn.